Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So today I wanted to talk about how to submit your short stories and hopefully how to publish them. So a little while ago I did a video on how to write a short story. So if you want a lot of my thoughts on technical tips for writing short stories, you can check that out. I will leave it in the cards. Today I wanted to talk about something that might concern you a couple steps down the line, and that is publishing. If you are writing short stories, there's a chance that at some point you might like to try to publish them. So I wanted to impart some of my wisdom. A lot of this is stuff that you could just Google. There's not that much that's secret to it. However, I have been submitting for quite a couple years. I've gotten a lot of tips from professors. I have published 2 stories. I do have one forthcoming. My first story, Me for Tea, that I published a couple years ago. I recently had a piece come out in The Puritan, which is an online Canadian magazine. You can read that in the description. And I recently was just accepted by the Fiddlehead. So I wanted to kind of share the basics, just kind of the 101. And then I also wanted to share some resources for where you can submit, because I get asked that all the time. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about strategy. I don't want anyone to overthink submission strategy, but it is something that I've thought a little bit about. Also, I just want to say that I am not magazine editor or anything. I've just had some pieces published. And I've talked to a lot of people in the industry, but if you are a magazine editor or you have experience with that, or you think something I'm saying you've heard differently, please let me know in the comments. This is just what I've heard, so if you've heard differently, let me know, and I'm sure it does vary magazine by magazine and maybe country by country as well. So number 1, almost everything runs through a platform called Submittable nowadays. Submittable is great. I think when you have no other option, like you can't not submit through Submittable, and sometimes when you're forced to use a certain platform, it sucks. But we're forced to use this platform and it's great. I'm a big fan. You can get an app, it's like $3, it's worth it. You can check up on your submissions whenever you want. So if you go to a magazine's website and you click on their submit tab, there will probably be a button that will then take you to their submittable page and you can submit. And it will look a little different depending on how the magazine set it up. This is most magazines. There are some that don't, but most of them, probably 98% of magazines, are using Submittable nowadays. I've maybe sent 2 submissions that weren't through Submittable. A few places are still doing snail mail, but most of them are phasing it out. If you are sending in by mail, I have heard not to staple the story and you should just have everything loose leaf in the envelope. I was once told that they would throw it out if it was stapled, but I've also heard from writers who sent them in stapled because they didn't know that and they got personalized rejections. So I don't know if they'll necessarily throw it out, but I have heard that you're not supposed to staple it. If you know differently or you have a decisive answer on that, please let me know. You'll find a lot of articles that say make an Excel sheet. If you are only using Submittable, you probably don't need to make an Excel sheet because it will track everything beautifully for you. You can go to your submissions tab, it will have all of them listed. You can see the state of the submission. As soon as you submit outside Submittable, then I would recommend keeping track of that somewhere, because it's general etiquette that if you submit multiple places and then you get accepted in one place, you have to notify everywhere else you've submitted to and say, sorry, this piece has been accepted. A couple very general rules. Proofread. You should be submitting the highest quality of work that you can produce. And along with that, this is the baseline rule, but read the magazine. Look, I will be honest. I have not read an issue of every single magazine that I have ever submitted to in my life. And especially when I started submitting, I submitted very widely. Now I kind of have my set magazines that I usually submit to because they're my top choices for being published in. Generally submit to kind of the same ones, and I know those magazines well. I know what kind of work they're interested in. But when I was starting, I kind of just went on Submittable and I submitted everywhere that would take me. Did I read every magazine? No, I didn't. It is good practice to know the magazines well. I'm not saying what I did back then was smart. Along with that, again, this should be the biggest no-brainer of all time, but I'm going to reiterate it. Read the submission guidelines. Some have different submission guidelines. Some want your name in the document. Some don't want your name in the document. Some want the cover letter in the document. Some want it in a certain font, formatted a certain way. Always read the submission guidelines, because if you don't and you submit, it's gonna look like you refuse to do the most basic possible work to submit here. And that's not gonna look good. It takes 2 minutes to read the submission guidelines for a magazine. Some magazines will have specific formatting specs, some won't. But when in doubt, double space, don't put your name on the document. Only put your name in the document if they request it. Most magazines do blind submissions, and a lot of the time if they do blind submissions and they get one that has your name on it, they won't read it because their policy is a blind submission. And use a legible industry standard font. Times New Roman, Arial, or Garamond. I use Garamond because it's the best font ever. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about for just the basics is contests versus regular submissions. So the differences here are basically that contests usually have larger submission fees but big prize money. Regular submissions usually have no reading fee or it's a low reading fee, probably under $7. They will pay a standard rate. It could be as low as nothing. It could be, you know, $25, $50, $75. It could be quite high. Like I said, I'm getting published in the Fiddlehead. They pay $60 a page because they're one of Canada's most established magazines, so they pay buck. Some magazines give you a very small honorarium, some just give you a certain number of copies. It all depends, just based on the magazine and how much funding they have access to. Usually the prize money for a contest is way bigger. Like you can win thousands of dollars in a contest. You're probably not gonna make thousands of dollars off of a regular submission unless you're publishing in like the New Yorker, which if you are, good for you, man. In terms of submitting to contests, like I said, they can have steep submission fees. If you are not rich, you can set a budget. For example, I'm gonna have $60 of contest submission fees for this year. I've seen contests that have a $40 submission fee. There's also kind of generally the understanding that you can simultaneously submit on a regular submission. Simultaneous submission is submitting the same story to multiple magazines. So now most will accept simultaneous submissions unless it's a contest. Now let's talk a little bit about cover letters. Now a cover letter is the short story equivalent to a query letter, but it's so much simpler and it's really not something that you have to fret about too much. You don't need to say what the story is about. In fact, you shouldn't say what the story is about unless the magazine specifically tells you to, and most will not. Really, what you want to say in a cover letter is the word count, the genre, whether it's a simultaneous submission, the title, and anything notable. So if it's been on a long list, if it's been on a short list, you don't want to say something like, say you get a personalized rejection, but it's not like a long list or anything. Don't say like, dear editors, I'm submitting to you my story, The Brown Baby Goose. This is an unpublished piece of 3,000 words, and I've received 2 personalized rejections from this and that magazine, and please publish me magazine. They don't care. If you've stealth published, now this is the tea. I don't know how magazine editors feel about me saying this. Stealth publishing is what I would say is when you publish somewhere, but the circulation is so small that it doesn't really count. The main example of this is you're published in a non-campus magazine. I have been published in on-campus magazines before. I consider those stories previously unpublished. And this is what editors of those magazines have told me. Now, I haven't actually had anything that I've had published in an on-campus magazine accepted elsewhere, but I still submit them and I consider them unpublished because the circulation is so small and no one outside my university has access to this magazine. It's basically like it being unpublished. So that's what I mean, it's self-published. You've published in your university's magazine and now you're submitting elsewhere. You're submitting it as an unpublished story. Don't say that it's been in your university magazine. Like everyone I know does, but just don't boast about it. Like it might seem nice to be like, oh, my university published this. If they hear that, they're gonna go, so it's published. Always personalize to the editor if you can. Most magazines will list their masthead on their website. You might have to do a bit of digging, but do it. You don't want to say to whom it may concern. When in doubt, if you really can't find a single name, I would recommend saying, dear editors of the magazine, and name the magazine. It just makes it look less like a copy and pasted cover letter rather than you're just submitting to every place over and over and over, not paying attention. You know, it makes it look more like you genuinely want to be here in this specific magazine. In terms of bio, you can include a very brief bio. If you've never been published, that's fine. Just say, if accepted, this will be my first published piece. If you've been published elsewhere, you can mention it. I wouldn't mention university magazines, even if it's a different story. In terms of your bio, keep it brief again. I usually just say that I'm a writer from Vancouver. The reason I often say this is because I'm usually submitting to Canadian lit mags and I want them to know that I'm Canadian. And I'll talk about this a bit in a second, but at least in Canada, a lot of magazines are getting, they're getting grants, they're getting funded. In order to get that, oftentimes it means that they have to publish a certain percentage of Canadian authors. Maybe this isn't a thing in the US and it doesn't matter, but that's why I always say that I'm from Vancouver. If you've had anything else published or are forthcoming anywhere, if you are an alumni of a writing program, you can mention that, but I wouldn't necessarily mention it all the time. There are some magazines that kind of look down on the university writing model. So my recommendation would be, if it's a university affiliated magazine and you're a student or an alumni of a writing program, say so in the bio, because if you're submitting to a magazine that runs out of a university, of course they probably don't have this bias. But if it's a non-university affiliated magazine, maybe don't. There are some editors who don't like that model. They have this idea that writing students are gonna kind of churn out kind of inane, repetitive, uninspired work that's kind of a bit washed out, and they're gonna go in with that bias. If the magazine runs out of a university, obviously they probably don't think that. So this was my cover letter to the Fiddlehead. Cover letters are generally kind of just gonna sound like this. It's pretty standard. So I said, "Dear Sue Sinclair and Fiddlehead editorial board, I am pleased to submit Barefoot for your consideration in the Fiddlehead. This is a fiction piece of 5,840 words and is not under consideration anywhere else. It is unpublished but received an honorable mention in Glimmer Train's Family Matters contest. I'm a Vancouver-born writer currently in my 4th year of my university's writing program. My fiction has appeared in Meat for Tea, The Valley Review, and is forthcoming in The Puritan. Thank you for your time and consideration, Shaylin Bishop." I will leave a template from Prism magazine of what a cover letter should look like, and they show how to format it in the description. It's a great resource if you are trying to write one, and once you write one, they're basically all the same. Let's talk about where to find places to submit. So the first one is Readsy's Literary Magazine Directory. Yes, I work for Readsy, but they didn't ask me to say this. I just plug our resources all the time because what can I say, we make great resources, and this resource is excellent. They have a contest directory and a LitMag directory that have a ton of information. You can see the circulation, you can see how much they pay, you can see what they accept. It's really, really useful. It's a great place to start. You can also sign up for the Literistic newsletter. They will send you open submissions and contests. There's a paid version that gives you, it's like 40% more or something. I just have the free version, but you can opt for the paid version and get that inside scoop. One thing that I would really recommend is get yourself one of these, ideally the most recent. This is a Best American Short Stories. Now, tailor this to where you live. If you're submitting to the American market, get Best American Short Stories. There's Best Canadian Short Stories. We also have the Journey Prize. Now, you can not only see the magazines where people were published, a lot of them will be the New Yorker, so, you know, that's not exactly a starter magazine. And then they have this, a giant index of magazines, American and Canadian magazines publishing short stories. It's a solid 3.5 pages. This is a great resource. It gives you a ton of options. Submittable, which I've already expressed my love for, you can just browse upcoming deadlines, honestly. When I first started submitting, I wasn't picky. I just wanted to submit my story. I wasn't thinking that I wanted to be in specific magazines. I really just kind of wanted a publication credit. You can just browse upcoming submissions. You can filter them. You can browse based on whether or not they have a reading fee. It can be a great way to find new places to submit. There's a podcast I really like, the LitMag Love podcast. It's hosted by Rachel Thompson. It runs out of Room magazine. It's great. She interviews editors from other magazines. The first season or 2 are basically just all Canadian. Since she's talked to a lot of those editors already in the newest season, and she's kind of getting into more like American magazines or like more niche magazines, so it's a really great resource. You get to hear it directly from the editor and what they do and don't want to see more of. Another great way is to find authors that you like and see where they're published. You just go to the acknowledgments section, or sometimes it's a note at the beginning of a short story collection. The author will often list where the stories have been previously published. That's great, especially if there's an author that you really feel like you vibe with and you write similar work to them. Another thing you can do, follow LitMags on Twitter. Other LitMags that are similar will pop up underneath in the recommendeds when you follow them, and also they'll probably interact with each other a lot, and they'll like retweet issues that are coming out from similar magazines. So you can kind of see, like, let's say there's a magazine you really like and you kind of vibe with them. What other magazines does that magazine vibe with? And then the final thing that you can do is kind of to just Google it, you know, sift through Google. Magazines in Canada, magazines in wherever you live, magazines that publish short stories, magazines that publish flash fiction, magazines that publish crime fiction, whatever it is. And you might have to do some sifting. It's kind of just part of the process. So let's talk a little bit about rejections. Rejections usually come in tiers, but don't overthink it too much because it really does depend on the magazine. Different magazines, you know, they have different drafts of different tiers and stuff. It all kind of just works within the magazine. Some magazines have weird rejection letters. Anytime you get anything that just specifically speaks to an element of the story, that is a pretty high tier rejection. Lowest tier is basically just like, thank you for submitting to this magazine. I'm afraid it's not for us at the time. And it's pretty curt. Like, you can feel when it's pretty curt. I've gotten a couple that are pretty curt and I'm like, you really didn't want this in your site, did you? Then next up, you'll get like polite, but it's clearly been sent to 500 people, where it's basically like, thank you for considering us. Unfortunately, it's not for us at this time, where we encourage you to submit again. It doesn't say anything specific, but it's nice. It's encouraging. You should submit again with that rejection. Then up from that, you might get something like a personalized rejection. Like, I got a rejection recently that said, you know, we found much to admire in this subtle story. They didn't necessarily give me specific feedback because I don't think that magazine does that, but they put like an adjective to it. And then kind of the highest tier of personalized rejection, that's still rejection you can get, from the editor personally will say this story made it very far in our, editorial process, or they might say it made it to the final round of our editorial process. They'll probably say things they liked about it specifically. That's the kind of thing you don't get often, and it basically means it came down to what fit the issue best. Those happen once in a blue moon, but I've seen them. Anytime that an editor is kind of specifically reaching out to you, you know it's good. Like, I got one recently that was for a contest, and it was from the editor herself, and she was like, I wanted to let you know that you were very close to making the long list. The more you submit, the more you'll kind of be able to read these rejection letters. Now, the reason why it's good to read rejection letters is because they're letting you know if the work vibes with them or not. Kind of the more personalized that rejection is, the more that you should submit to that magazine again, and do it soon before they switch editors. Let's talk a little bit about strategy. This has been a long video, but strategy isn't something that I want you guys to overthink or think that submitting is all about strategy, because ultimately it's about three things. It's about having quality story, it's about doing your research, and it's about patience. It's a long game, y'all. So when I say strategy, I don't mean like you're like playing a shady game, but there's smart ways to submit and there are dumb ways to submit. There are kind of two strategies that I would recommend taking. The first one is what's generally advised, and that's to submit in tiers. If you only have one or two stories that are submittable that you're submitting, this is probably the best strategy for you. So submitting in tiers basically means that you think about all the magazines you want to be published in, and you have your top tier magazine, and they're the magazines you most want to be published in. But maybe those are the ones that are, a long shot. Then you have your second tier, magazines that you'd still be happy to publish in. The general strategy is to submit the story to the top tier, and when those get rejected, submit to the next tier, then the next tier, then the next tier. The reason for that is because you're published in whoever accepts you first. You can't get published in a magazine and then go, I gotta think on it. I'm still waiting to hear back from the New Yorker. You can't do that. You can't shop around, you can't wait to hear back from someone else. It's not like getting an agent in this way. You go with who takes the story. Because wouldn't it be sad if the New Yorker was gonna accept you and then a random ass magazine that has a circulation of 5 accepted you? Best to have the peace of mind that the New Yorker rejected you first. Now, the second strategy is not one I've heard people talk about, but it's kind of what I do. What I like to do is what I consider rolling submission. And now, of course, you're still kind of using a tier system, but for me, once you have multiple stories that you're submitting, what I personally like to do is submit multiple stories at a time to 1 or 2 places each. So you have story A at magazine A, story B at magazine B, story C at magazine C, story D at magazine D. Then, when you get all those rejections, then you submit A at B, you submit B at A, you submit C at D, D at C, etc., etc. The reason for doing this, it helps you avoid this mistake that I have made many times, and that mistake is you submit to your whole top tier. You feel good about the story. Then, some time passes, you decide you're gonna open up the document again. You realize you wanna make edits, maybe substantial edits. You get all those rejections. Maybe some of them are personalized. You're thinking in your mind, maybe I could have had it if I submitted the story in this later draft. The story is only gonna improve with time, because although it's easy to say, this story is fully polished, I'm never touching it again, rarely does that happen. I'm always gonna pick up my stories until the day they get published. I just blew through my top 5 magazines that I want to publish in, and I can't submit to them again. You can't just submit again, when it's revised. This way, you get the chance to revise. You still have a lot of submissions out. You're not putting all your eggs in one basket. You still have 5 submissions out at a time, but it's just different stories. So you're kind of giving yourself more options to revise. So say all those 5, get rejected, you haven't lost as many future submission options for each story, if that makes sense. The other benefit of this is that it leaves you open for contests. You can't simultaneously submit in a contest, but because all your stories are only out in one place at a time, or maybe 2 places at a time, it gives you the option to then submit that story, one of them, to a contest. You know, there have been times where I want to submit to a contest, but the story's out, so I have to wait for all the submissions to come back. Maybe the contest closes by then. It's a whole pain. This gives you a bit more freedom of what you want to do with individual stories. You don't have to wait for 5 rejections to come in. That could take a year. So that's kind of a strategy that I think is pretty clever as the master strategist that I am. So now I just wanted to talk about a couple things that you can do to up your chances of getting accepted. Obviously, the best thing you can do is submit a clean, strong, interesting story that suits what the magazine is looking for and format it properly. These are a couple little tricks that can just give you an edge. So number 1, if a contest deadline gets extended, that means that the pool of submissions is probably a little small. A little smaller than the magazine wanted, because they're extending the deadlines. If there's a contest that you maybe weren't thinking of entering because maybe there was a submission fee and who wants to pay submission fees, but then the deadline passes and then they're like, we're extending the deadline. Not a lot of people submitted to that. They probably didn't submit because just like you, they didn't want to pay the fee. Number 2 is if the contest is mail-in, very few people will submit. I heard from someone once he got on a long list and he basically said that he thinks the reason he got on that long list was because it was a mail-in submission, and everyone is simply too lazy. There are magazines that I've wanted to submit to and I haven't done it because they're mail-in. People are lazy, man. They're too lazy to send a letter. This is a call out. I am too. Another great way to give yourself an edge is just to submit to niche magazines. There are magazines that specifically say publish queer authors. There's like Loose Leaf and Rice Paper. Both of them, they specifically publish Asian authors. If that space is for you, it was made for you, and it probably means fewer people are submitting to it. A lot of magazines run off government funding. Oftentimes, for a magazine to get government funding, they need to have a certain percentage of the stories or pieces they publish to be from authors from that country, and it can be as high as 80%. If you're a youth, there's so many magazines and opportunities for youth. It's hard to be a highly competent writer at a young age, so it can be easy for your piece to stand out if it's really well done. That is a great place to start. I didn't submit as much as a teenager, and I regret that. Like the one time that I did, I won a big poetry prize. I was like 14. I mean, I'm not good at poetry now, to be fair, but sometimes magazines will have themed issues. Again, this can narrow it down. If you have a piece that you think really well fits a themed issue, now of course a lot of themed issues are really vague and really anything could go. But if you find a themed issue, again, that's narrowing out some people. And also just if you have like a niche story, if you can find a magazine that kind of has a more niche mission statement. So for example, magazines like Ecotone, they publish specifically place-based writing. Anytime there's any criteria beyond we want good fiction, because a lot of magazines, when they say what they're looking for, they basically go, we want stories that surprise us, that intrigue us. We want interesting turns of phrase, we want well-drawn characters. We're not limited by subject or theme. So basically they're just saying we want good stories. But as soon as it's anything beyond that, you're immediately in a narrower pool. So just a couple final like morale tips. Number 1, learn to embrace rejection and set a rejection goal. Everyone gets rejected and everyone gets rejected a lot. I have my submittable open. I have submitted a grand total of 62 times. 4 of those are currently active. I've had 3 acceptances. I've withdrawn 8 times. That means that I have gotten a grand total of 47 rejections. I worked hard for those rejections. I spent money for some of those rejections. So what I would recommend is set a rejection goal. First time I ever started submitting was the summer of 2017, and I set myself a goal of getting 10 rejections, and before I could get 10 rejections, one of my stories was getting published. You can't really set acceptance goals because it's just a bit of a luck game. Don't get discouraged. I know like just me saying this only means so much, but really, like I just said, I've gotten over 40 rejections, almost 50 rejections. And that's just how it is. That's just how it plays out. You know, if you get really discouraged by every rejection you get, you're never gonna submit. What I have noticed is, if you're a competent writer, if you're getting some kind of positive feedback, but never getting published, if you just keep at it, you will eventually. I am from a writing cohort. I can tell you that those of us who continually just kept at it, kept submitting, have all been published. If you submit and you keep at it, chances are eventually your moment will come. A rejection doesn't necessarily mean that the story was bad. Magazines have very limited space. They get way more stories than they can accept, and they get more stories that they like that they can accept. Sometimes it just has to do with what's right for them at a time. You know, they might say this, we admire the story, but it just wasn't right for us. It just wasn't right for the issue. It doesn't vibe with what else was in the issue. A lot of magazines have a less than 1% acceptance rate. Glimmer Train, you know, rest in peace. That was like my favorite magazine. It was my dream publication. They were statistically harder to get into than Harvard Law. It's not a quick process. It takes a lot of commitment. It also forces you to just thicken up your skin, you know? You have to get over the fact that you're gonna get rejected. You're gonna get rejected a lot. It doesn't mean that the story was bad or that the story can never be published. My story that I just got accepted in the Fiddlehead, I think that story had been rejected 12 times. When I submitted it to the Fiddlehead, I was submitting it to them because they were like one of the few magazines I'd never submitted to. They were one of the few places I could submit left, and I kind of thought as I was submitting to them, at this point, no one's gonna publish the story. Where I was like, this is gonna be the last time I submit this story. After this rejection, I'm moving on and I'm gonna start submitting other pieces. I've been submitting this story for like a year and a half, almost 2 years. At a certain point, I have to let it die. It was kind of my last chance, and then they accepted it. You never know, like, you have to keep at it. You never know when it's gonna happen. There's no rush. I know it feels like there's a rush. I got this big thing in my mind where I'm like, I want to publish my short story collection, but I need to publish the stories first, so I feel like there's a rush. There is not a rush. So that's kind of what I have to say on publishing short stories. It's kind of amazing that I made a video on the same topic for Reason. It was 5 minutes long. That just goes to show you how long-winded I am when I'm not forcing myself to be concise. But I wanted to just give you guys kind of all my like insider scoops. A lot of it is just stuff that I have noticed or people I know have noticed. Because once you do this long enough, you just start to realize how the game works. You start to realize how it plays out, especially with rejection. The more you get rejected, the more it's kind of okay. Let me know how you guys are doing. Are you submitting? Are you published? What's going on? I want to know how you guys are doing, and I want to know how you guys are killing it. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I will see you in another video.